Okay, just got some chats in.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Are we doing the first part or the second part?
Well, we did the first part last year.
Okay.
So last year we did the Ministry of the Death Penalty Part 1, and today we're going to do Ministry of the Death Penalty Part 2. We'd like to cover papers that are either explorations of things that are outside the box or things that are inside the box that need a closer inspection. And of course, the death penalty is one of those topics. You know, naturally, we hate to see people die, you know, and as Pentecostals and as Christians, you know, we are, you know, we hate to see people die. You know, we're pro-life. We love giving people, we love seeing abortion clinics burned down. Not that we started it, but, you know, we hate abortion clinics. We love life. And you would think that Pentecostals would like to see criminals live forever in prison. But actually, the biblical response to murder and a few other things is the death penalty. So the question is it inconsistent to like the death penalty? Is the death penalty against God, or is it one of God's plans? And so I wrote this paper. In fact, the teacher who inspired me, I mean, I was teaching, and one of my teachers, like while I was teaching at Bible college, I was always taking courses. And every year I was writing, every semester I was writing theses, because I love writing papers. And I had a teacher who, he gave me a book to read. It was John Grisham's The Chamber.
Ah, yes.
And I thought, you know, this is an interesting story, but it's basically anti-death penalty propaganda. And I found out my teacher friend was against the death penalty. And so I thought, you know, because Grisham writes good books, you know, and they're well written and good storyline, gets his message across. But I saw the message. I said, you know, I don't know if that's biblical. So I looked it up, did some studying, and I had that particular teacher grade my paper. Yeah. So I could, you know, see if I was successful or not in writing a good paper. So here is the second half of the Ministry of the Death Penalty. The first part, we talked about things like prisons in the Old Testament times. You know, there were no prisons. We had cities of refuge. So if a person killed somebody accidentally, they can flee to a city of refuge. They can live their life inside that city. But if they killed them intentionally, you know, the person who is next of kin of the person who died, that person has been appointed by God to be the avenger of blood, to hunt down that person and kill them. No penalties, because it's supposed to be, you know, you're the avenger. But now that we see that God in the New Testament has given the position of avenger to the government, which at that time was the Roman government. So we'll go into the paper. I'll read it, and then we'll ask some questions afterwards. I love questions. Okay, so the Ministry of the Death Penalty, Part 2, Apostolic Pentecostal Theological Symposium at the Pentecostals of Sydney. Again, I want to shout out a big thank you to Brother Stan Harvey, pastor of the Pentecostals of Sydney and General Superintendent of the United Pentecostal Church of Australia. I really appreciate you, brother, and your whole team letting us use this church building and being able to share these truths. And maybe one year we'll have the symposium when you're not out preaching. He's a very busy man. But he actually attended one a couple of years ago. And that's when he says, you know, this is a good thing. This is something that needs a better venue. And so I appreciate you having us over, brother. And I want to send out a shout out to all of our speakers too. We have Andrew Robertson, Brother Pastor Frank Myers, Rob Campbell, and myself. And we want more. We want to inspire more people to write papers. I hope that's you. Okay, the Ministry of the Death Penalty, Part 2. I'm going to follow on screen. Introduction. There is a perverted pacifist disposition. And when I say perverted, I mean using pacifism to apply to death penalty. Pacifism is good, but there's a perverted pacifism, which is where you use pacifism to say we shouldn't be killing people for the death penalty because killing's bad. It's rampant in Pentecost, and I find it quite disturbing. Yes, I know the refusal to bear arms has been a popular trend among your more radical reformers, like the Anabaptists and the Pentecostals, especially the Anabaptists. And I know that we used to have a pacifist statement in our UPCI manual, but I don't think that this should bleed over into our theology concerning the death penalty. Not all taking of human life is bad, nor does it fall under the jurisdiction of the sixth commandment, which states, "Thou shalt not kill." My desire to promote God's cause for the affirmation among his people for the validity of the death penalty. I don't enjoy the death of sinners any more than Jesus does, but there are certain reasons why the deaths of certain felons honors God and restores his blessings to a nation. I would like to make these issues underlying the death penalty clear to the praying, tithing, God-fearing saints who would like for their yeas to be God's yeas and their nays to be God's nays. So point 3, if you want point 2, they're in last year's book. How has the death penalty been understood? A, under the law of Moses. Something might be noticeably absent from the Old Testament in the economy and plan of God is the presence of prison systems. Wicked kings have tossed faithful prophets into pits of slime or into dens of lions, but not until we open the New Testament do we see Roman prisons like what we have today. Cities of refuge may have served as temporary prisons for those who have feigned innocence, but the elders were required to turn the guilty parties over to the avenger of blood if the accused were not found innocent. Now, what was the Lord's avenue of dealing with sin? We can see that the only recourse for omitting sin from his people's camp was the death of the offender. For lesser crimes, there was a utilization of restitution to man. It's called lex talionis, and it usually, even though it said eye for eye and tooth for tooth, it usually boiled down to how much money this person owed that person. And for sins against God, there were the offerings of the tabernacle. To save space, I'll provide a list in form of all the crimes mentioned in the law of Moses, which was given to Israel alone, for which the death penalty was deemed appropriate. Now, of course, we are not the nation of Israel, so these no longer apply to us except for whatever God might say still applies yet. So murder, adultery, incest, bestiality, sodomy, rape of a betrothed virgin, kidnapping, fornication of a priest's daughter, witchcraft, offering of a human sacrifice, striking or cursing a parent, disobedience to parents, blasphemy, desecrating the Sabbath, prophesying falsely or teaching false doctrines, sacrificing to false gods, refusing to abide by the decision of the court. All of these were counted worthy of the death penalty, although sometimes we only see once. For example, violating the Sabbath. Only one time was a person actually murdered or killed for that. And ever since then, they haven't been. But I believe God allowed that first one to go to let everyone know that God takes his Sabbath very seriously. So not all of these were consistently insisted on by God, but they were given to let us know that certain sins are particularly abominable in God's eyes. Furthermore, it would seem appropriate to include in a paper on this topic all of the methods of execution condoned by the Lord of hosts. It would be an interesting study to compare today's methods with those of the ancient nation of Israel. How would the Lord's methods of execution stand up against today's logic, which is compassionate towards a criminal and oblivious to the suffering and violence inflicted upon the victim? What impact would those laws have upon potential criminals weighing the consequences? Stoning was the usual method for executing the death penalty. At least 2 witnesses were needed to verify a charge, and they had to throw the first stone. So if they had a conscience, if they were lying, their conscience would stop them from participating. The logic here is to prevent singular revenge of witnesses and trusting the witnesses to have a conscience that would allow them to participate in the penalty for which their testimony demands. Burning was the penalty for incest and harlotry, particularly if committed by a priest's daughter. Death was inflicted by the sword, by the spear, and shooting by arrow. However, these were spontaneous punishments upon Israelites and for foreigners at war. Beheading in practice was reserved especially for those who had cursed or insulted royalty, although there was no such biblical mandate. In fact, there's that real funny story in Samuel where this guy was mocking David, and the guy says, "Can I go over and take his head off?" You know, so that was amusing. He didn't follow through with it. David, being very humble, said there might be something there. According to the law, the death penalty was to be carried out by the witnesses, by the congregation, and or by the lone avenger of blood. There were no job opportunities for executioner in the help wanted section. Now, in the age of the apostles, by the time of Jesus, the nation of Israel was merely a territory under the administration of the Roman Empire. Clive, something's happening on your screen. I'm going to clear it. Something's happening. So let's see. So Israel was a territory under the administration of the Roman Empire. The apostles, unlike Old Testament prophets, kings, or judges, were unauthorized, nor were they interested in meting out justice. One might even say that the Lord had delegated this whole branch of responsibility into the hands of his servant Rome and left the more important business of evangelization to his apostles and saints. How frugal, how convenient. Now, crucifixion was carried out in New Testament times only by Roman decree and by Roman soldiers for those convicted of major crimes like murder and political insurrection against Rome. Jewish authorities under Roman rule were not normally permitted.
Concentrate.
There we go. Let's see, so Jewish authorities under Roman rule were not normally permitted to execute anyone. Although rare exceptions are recorded, like Stephen and others, whether these were permitted by Rome is difficult to say. I highly doubt it, but if pressed, the Jewish leaders may claim to have been highly agitated on religious matters and to have done it in order to protect the peace. What was the opinion of the New Testament saint towards the death penalty? Were they totally averse to it? Did it contradict every vestige of the faith as delivered by Jesus Christ to man? Has it been nullified by the introduction of the age of grace? Does it really matter what they thought? I believe so. Now, the institution of government was created by God and placed in the hands of men. How they fulfill that divine mandate decides the fate of the nation. As an American and as an Australian, I believe it is just as important to strive for a godly attitude towards capital punishment as it is towards abortion and euthanasia. In fact, all three of these are related by the concept of innocent blood soiling the land. We will reap as a nation what we allow ourselves to sow or to plant as a nation. Now, as bad as Rome was with all their sin, slavery, gladiator battles, and sexual promiscuity, we see that Paul did not see it thoroughly bad light. Paul knew that the rule of government was an institution of God and that all governments uphold basically the same few values, true to circumspection. In fact, Paul went so far as to say that the government was the minister of God, a phrase he only uses here and in 1 Thessalonians 3:2. Thus the title of my paper, The Ministry of the Death Penalty, because the government is called several times here, the minister of God. Now the government as a higher power represents God in all authority. All who resist it resist God. In the following verses, Paul identifies some of the responsibilities of the government and some of the duties that saints should therefore render for the services it provides. Romans 13:1-7, this is the important part. Paul says, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. That powers that be are ordained of God. Whoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, or they shouldn't be, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. Talking about the government. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. Paul says he's going to take your head off. He's not going to shake it and scare you. He's going to take your head off. For he is the minister of God, a revenger, to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Again, the revenger or the avenger was actually a near of kin in the Old Testament, but now God is telling us through Paul that the government now is the next of kin, the revenger, to execute wrath upon him that does evil. Wherefore, you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. And for this cause, pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers. We're paying taxes so they can take the heads off of bad people. So they can attend continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues. Tribute to tribute is due. Custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. So Paul says that we should be obedient to the government and receive praise from the same. For if we do evil, the government has another responsibility. Paul says the government is now the revenger, the legal avenger of blood, a role given in the Mosaic law. And it has the right to execute wrath with the sword. He says the government does not bear the sword in vain, which means that the sword is surely to kill, and not merely to threaten. In fact, Paul goes so far as to say that this is the very reason why we pay taxes to the government, so he can administrate justice and kill offenders. Should we reap the pleasures of a safe civilization due to a legal justice system and then scoff at the system and deriding them for killing people? Not hardly. Paul says we are to obey, pay custom, and honor those who are in authority. We are the king's kids, yes, but we are to be submissive and support the Roman government. And if I don't mention it, it's the same Roman government that probably killed Paul by accident as well. Acts 25:11, Paul said, "For if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of those things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar." So he says, listen, if I've done anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. It's the way it's supposed to be. Paul was willing to die if he could be proven to be an offender, but he knew that becoming a Christian meant becoming a better citizen, and he practiced what he preached. Paul knew that the Roman legal system had many benefits despite the sin that ran rampant throughout the administration and the kingdom. Another wonderful benefit was appealing to Caesar. Christianity itself had much to appreciate Rome for. The roads that made travel easier, the soldiers that made traveling safer, and etc. All these things made Christianity much easier to spread and paved the way for the coming of Jesus Christ. So again, I've written papers as well talking about how Rome was not all that bad. And Pilate and Herod were not all that bad. Herod's an interesting person. Okay, let's bring it to today. And I wrote this paper in the 1990s when I was in America, but I have added some content from Australia as well. The death penalty in America. Now, the 8th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, part of the Bill of Rights, prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, as well as the setting of excessive bail or the imposition of excessive fines. The word is taken almost verbatim from the English Bill of Rights of 1689, which provides that excessive bail ought not to be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Now, punishments that have been declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court include torture and loss of citizenship. The court has also excluded punishment that's excessive in relation to the crime committed, such as prison sentences for narcotics addiction. In Furman versus Georgia, the court struck down all existing capital punishment statutes by ruling that the optional death penalty violated the 8th Amendment. Many states, however, immediately passed new statutes making capital punishment mandatory for certain crimes. So the question, who is truly pro-life? If the deliberate extinguishment of human life has any effect at all, it more likely tends to lower our respect for life and brutalize our values. This is Supreme Court Justice William Brennan, architect of Roe versus Wade, another piece of bad law, writing against capital punishment in Furman versus Georgia. But what was his source of authority? Pro-abortionists linked the issues of abortion and capital punishment over and over again in debates, literature, and propaganda campaigns. The goal is to try and make pro-life activists look inconsistent. And we all know that inconsistency is the ultimate neoliberal sin. In reality, of course, it is the pro-aborts who are being inconsistent. While fully supporting the slaughter of more than 1.5 million innocent preborn babies annually, the pro-abortionists feigned concern for the handful of guilty condemned murderers who are put to death in this country every year. There's an incredible difference between the two. One is innocent, the one they wish to kill, and one is guilty of murder, the one they wish to save. They whine that capital punishment is an ineffective deterrent, that it's racist, that it's cruel and unusual, and it should be banned based upon the fact that there might be a slim possibility that an innocent soul might be destroyed. Do they mean terminated? Do they regret terminating innocent souls? It sounds like that's exactly what they're doing with abortion. Another prominent pro-abortionist, syndicated social issues columnist Coretta Scott King, expertly summarized the pro-abortion double standard in her May column without the slightest sense of irony. Capital punishment is racist in its application. It should be banned because it makes irrevocable any possible miscarriage of justice. The lives of innocent people are threatened by capital punishment. It can never produce genuine healing. Allowing the state to kill its own citizens diminishes our humanity. Now, substitute the word abortion for the words capital punishment, and you have a good summary of the pro-life philosophy. Abortion commits the same sins. So, strangely, King and most other vocal capital punishment opponents are very pro-abortion. Kill the innocent and spare the guilty. Whose idea was that? Is capital punishment a deterrent? It is probably true that capital punishment, as it's currently applied in this country, is not a deterrent. All we need to do is look at the statistics. Each year, about 21,000 murders are committed in America, while about 20 people die in the electric chair or gas chambers annually. This means that a murderer has about a 1 in 1,000 chance of being executed for the crime of murderer. This is about equal to the chance that an innocent citizen will be murdered during his or her lifetime. So for all intents and purposes, this is negligible risk for murderers and naturally does not present a great deterrent effect. The odds are pretty good you're not going to suffer consequences for killing somebody. However, so I want to make sure I had everything muted. However, if everyone in society knew for a fact that they would swiftly pay with their lives if they killed someone else, there would be very little murder in this country today. In Middle Eastern Islamic nations, where a murderer can expect to be executed for his crime, the homicide rate is less than 1.5 per 100,000, then 20% that of the United States, 5 per 100,000. That's an 80% improvement. That does not even take into consideration the value of life difference between them. Now, is capital punishment cruel and unusual? It's uncomfortable maybe, but so what? The death penalty is certainly not unusual since virtually every nation since Noah has used it to one extent or another. A more proper term would be rare since only about 20 people are put to death in America every year. To put this into perspective, a person's chances of being struck and killed by lightning are more than 4 times greater than being put to death by the state. So all humans are not at risk of being killed by being innocently accused of a murder and terminated. Even if we were to accept that the death penalty is unusual, so what? The mere labeling of something as unusual is meaningless because such a description is purely neutral. In fact, some neoliberals use the quality of being different as a positive good. One example being the homosexual celebrate diversity slogan. Would we not agree that murder and rape are also unusual? Are they not unusual and deplorable enough to respond with an unusual and appropriate punishment? There is no doubt that the death penalty has been extremely cruel in the past. Many countries drowned or burned or tortured those people who were sentenced to death. As far as 20th century methods are concerned, anyone who has seen a videotape of an electric chair execution will be convinced on the spot that this particular form of death is cruel in the extreme. However, death does not have to be cruel, as the pro-euthanasia people like to remind us. For example, the most painless death imaginable would be execution by lethal injection. The Hemlock Society and anti-euthanasia groups have estimated that doctors have surreptitiously put hundreds or even thousands of people to sleep in this manner. And these are innocent people. Why not use this identical painless method on the execution of the guilty? Of course, anticipation can be agony, especially when your own life hangs in the balance. We may logically argue that a greater cruelty than death itself is the agony involved in waiting for months or years on death row and anticipation of execution. Most people would probably agree that months of anticipation of death is far worse than the process of death itself, particularly if this process is rendered completely painless. On the contrary, we have not mentioned the hideous traumas and tortures that many murderers have intentionally inflicted upon their helpless victims. If these murderers are so free to rape, torture, and kill their victims, why should they be spared death by far more humane means? Why need we argue for their mental comfort? Why do we treat them with gloves and serve them McDonald's? Or even steak dinners on the last day? Some argue that life imprisonment is a greater punishment than the death penalty, for the inmate realizes every day his crime and the price he's paying for it. Thus, life imprisonment is to be preferred. The inconsistencies multiply. And if this is the case, then life imprisonment should be considered cruel and very natural by the very nature that it is more painful and subjects the criminal to the most agony humanly possible over the greatest stretch of time. Capital punishment should be seen as merciful and compassionate if they wish to maximize their luxury and comfort after committing such heinous crimes. Or maybe they should do what is happening now. Murderers are being set free. So 4, is capital punishment effective? Criticism of the present prison system of punishment has focused mainly on its rehabilitative and preventive functions. Critics point out that recidivism, the commission of another crime after the offender has served a sentence for the first, is high. Thus, the system seems ineffective as a cure for or a restraint upon those factors and offenders which may lead to criminal acts. Furthermore, because there's no way to predict the future behavior of individuals, the length of sentence and the release date may have no relationship to the prison time necessary to effect a cure in or rehabilitate an offender. Many criminologists insist that there is no adequate body of empirical evidence to demonstrate that any punishment, capital punishment included, has a restraining effect on potential criminal behavior. Placing murderers in prison isn't a tough enough punishment. In jail, they would have a possible chance for parole. If they happen to make it back out to the world, who's to say that he or she wouldn't kill again? Of the 2,575 prisoners sentenced to death in 1992, 1 out of 11 had a prior conviction of homicide. This means additional people had to die before these murderers were sentenced to death. 257 more were murdered annually. What kind of justice is that? If the murderers were sentenced to death the first time they were convicted, innocent lives would not have to perish. By executing the murderers the first time around, justice would be served and the slaying of innocent lives would have been reduced by 10% guaranteed. 1 in 7 murders in the UK occur by suspects freed on bail for other crimes. Now, does this mean we should not parole or set free murderers? No. Of the 56,948 paroled released murderers from 1950 to 2016, only 466 killed again while on release or parole. That's less than 1% were killed again. Those are good statistics, say the Society for Police and Criminal Psychology. I disagree emphatically. They claim that so few murderers murder again seems to them that the majority of murderers have rehabilitated and are truly sorry for their crimes. For the 466 families devastated by the trivial few who murdered again, well, they don't matter. After all, we're talking about a country of 300 million. So that's not bad as far as they're saying, hey, Brother Andrew. Another reason that many people are against the death penalty, page 62, is because they feel that innocent people are continually being wrongfully executed in the name of justice. This is not true at all. There are many safeguards guaranteeing the protection of the rights of those facing the death penalty. These safeguards are: capital punishment must be imposed only for a crime for which the death penalty is prescribed by law at the time of its commission. Persons below 18 years of age, pregnant women, new mothers, or persons who have become insane shall not be sentenced to death. Capital punishment may be imposed only when guilt is determined by clear and convincing evidence, leaving no room for an alternative explanation of the facts. Capital punishment may be carried out only after a final judgment rendered by a competent court, allowing all possible safeguards to the defendant, including adequate legal assistance. Anyone sentenced to death shall receive the right to appeal to a court of higher jurisdiction. Anyone sentenced to death shall have the right to seek pardon or commutation of sentence. Capital punishment shall not be carried out pending an appeal, recourse procedure, or proceeding relating to pardon or commutation of the sentenced. Also, capital punishment shall be carried out so as to inflict the minimum possible suffering. So we see that not only is capital punishment effective in eliminating all chances of further homicides, but we see that the protective guards established by the American government make it harder to execute an alleged murderer than it is to kill an innocent man. In fact, so many innocent men and women have been removed from death row is only an evidence that the precautions against punishing an innocent person actually work. So we're no longer back in the 1950s or 60s, Alabama, where, you have a racist court and a racist judge. Those days are over. But nowadays, everyone has a much better chance of getting absolute justice. So a conclusion, what did I hope I've proven? As President Bush Sr. once emphasized, I agree that we need to be a kinder, gentler nation. My desire is not to produce a generation of cold-hearted apostolics who thirst after the blood of condemned murderers. To be so would be to put us at odds with the Spirit of Christ, who said, say unto them, as I live, saith the Lord God, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his evil way and live. Turn ye from your evil ways, for why will ye die, O house of Israel? Likewise, Peter in the New Testament showed a similar trait in the Lord's heart, showing us that nothing had changed between testaments. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. There is hope on death row. You can get saved on death row. I don't want to be underestimated in saying so. Many men have found Jesus, through some of our wonderful prison ministries, and I thank God for that. Even Paul once confessed, this is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptation, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. In fact, who knows how many felons have found Jesus through the delays provided by the inefficient and patronizing criminal justice system of today. I believe that despite how much joy this fact brings us, it would be better had these men not been murderers to begin with. There's no reason to limit each convict to only one homicide, so the numbers of those living would greatly exceed the number of those being executed in their stead. And the real problem lies in the realm of prevention, which we as a nation have not perfected. In fact, one might say that we have even decayed from the path that this nation had originally chosen. The concept of the social contract has been forgotten, the relinquishing of certain individual rights so that other basic rights of society might be protected, producing harmony and safety. Something new has been idealized where now we lobby for new rights for the individual that cater to our flesh at the expense of others. Something whereby now we cannot punish crime because man is no longer responsible for his own actions. He's a product or victim of society, and punishment would only confuse him. The death penalty, like spanking, only teaches us that might makes right, which results only in more violence, or so the rhetoric goes. So right and wrong have been misplaced. The 10 Commandments hang in the Senate and House, and prayers are read at the beginning of every session, but nobody knows of a rock whereby we can gauge where right becomes right and wrong becomes wrong. We have lost our landmark, our true source of authority. So these words are definable only in relation to how much pleasure or pain they bring to the populace. And there is only one result possible when criminals are treated as victims of society, thus diminishing the need for punishment and increasing the need for education and rehabilitation. Ecclesiastes 8:11 says, because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. I believe we as apostolics need to affirm the godly institution of the death penalty. The purpose it serves a nation is so important that Paul went so far as to call the government a minister of God when it fulfills its duty. We need to view it as a ministry. The benefits far outweigh the risks. Yes, innocent men like Paul, who defended the government, will die wrongly at the hands of the minister of God. Yes, repentant men like the thief on the cross will still have to pay their earthly dues. No, the death penalty is not the end. Just because one dies at the hands of men is no reason why one must end up in hell. Jesus himself forewarned us who has the final word. Fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. No, sir, the death penalty is not that bad. It was God's idea. It's a fear-based detriment. Abandoned, murder will rise. The death penalty, when delegated with human dignity and respect for the sanctity of life, contributes to social moral health and a greater safety for citizens. And I put here in my original copy of the paper that I printed for my, this was actually a thesis I did back in 1993. And here is a picture of a former commander of a Confederate prison in Anderson who was hanged on November 10, 1865, right there in view of the Capitol building. And so it was something that was obvious. It was done there for it was there for education. You know, they did it publicly for education and make sure people realize that if you treat people bad, this is what's going to happen. This commander, you know, he was starving and mistreating his prisoners. And I actually realized, it says I included this cartoon at the beginning of my thesis to lighten the mood because of the sad topic. But actually, I think deep down, I might have also done it because I knew that my grader was actually against the death penalty, and I was just kind of rubbing it in a little bit, you know, and it's called an electric chair operator's night school. Sorry, Lamar, down and up real fast is incorrect. Okay, Douglas, what's the correct answer? So yeah, so this was a paper I'd actually submitted. I wrote this first in 1993. I massaged it and updated it a little bit, and this is where I think the Lord stands. I really do think that the death penalty is a ministry. I think it's still valid today. Again, I don't want to see people die, but that happens. People kill people. What's the proper biblical response? Do we have any questions? Also, if you're online, you can chat in a question. I'll read it. Okay. Let's see. Okay, we have a question online. It says, in Indonesia, 2 Australian men were shot for bringing drugs into the country. I think it was more like 7 or 9, wasn't it?
2 were executed.
2 were executed?
They were all charged and sentenced to death, but 2, most of them commuted, but 2
Okay. Now, they didn't kill anyone. Is the death penalty justified here, where others got prison sentences? Well, again, I don't know everything about the case, but I believe drugs are absolutely terrible. Absolutely. And they shouldn't be brought into, they shouldn't be brought into countries. They shouldn't be marketed. But I do know that 1 or 2 of those men, I think maybe even one of them who died, was actually someone had actually gone out there and baptized him in Jesus' name. And
the 2 that were sentenced to death became believers, the other sentenced to drug addicts in prison.
Okay. So Andrew Robertson says that they were Christians and they were leaders, weren't they? They were actually inspiring others.
Testimony is incredible, in particular. People are spoken, but very, very impressive with us.
But they only became Christians after the death.
After a sin.
Whereas the other 7 who were given life sentences, they're on drugs still. They're probably still drugging up and miserable. Very interesting. Okay, very interesting. Takes a community to answer that question. Anybody else have an observation or a question? We have one, Frank.
How did you go with the paper in the original paper?
Let's see. Well, I actually, we had a little talk with the executive vice president of the college because of another cartoon I put in there. So I wasn't given a fond response, but I was given a passing grade. Yeah, but you know, I have some of my papers I've written over the years for Macquarie University, as well as many times, even if they didn't pass, I still count them as a win because I think I really nailed them. You know.
Comment?
Yes, comments as well.
As you said, Paul said, you know, I'm not against dying if I have to.
Mm-hmm.
But of interest is the thief on the cross. He said, you know, we're here, and our judgment is justified. So in the criminal's mind, the crime fitted the punishment fitted the crime, which is an interesting measure of where people were at.
Did you guys hear that out there? Give me a chat. Someone say yes if you heard that. The thief on the cross, he recognized that his crime was worthy of death. So that was an interesting observation.
Yes.
Just a good, honest observation. This is fair. I'm surprised I didn't put in here. I thought I put some stuff in here. Honest, every time I hear someone saying that they're free, they were released from prison after having killed someone, I keep saying to myself, why has that person been set free? Shouldn't they be set free when that person gets better? Then they can get free from prison. I mean, this one guy in particular, he got in trouble for doing something. I forgot what it was, but it turns out that, you know, he had actually killed a child. He actually had walked past a house. He saw the little boy taking a shower. He snuck into the house later to rape the boy, but the boy was sleeping with his sister and she screamed, so he killed her. And he ended up going to prison. And honest, a guy like that should have no career outside of prison, but he was set free. And that seems to be, you see it over and over again. People are going to prison for 12 to 14 years, and then they think, okay, you're better now. Okay. And I just think that's just ridiculous. Anyone who kills anyone, I think either you spend them in prison forever if you're not going to kill them, or do what the Bible says, and we should be avenging that blood, because innocent blood will be calling up a testimony against our country to God.
Yeah, I agree.
Modern society, once they're considered victims, they need help. And they claim society is willing to do that.
Yep, so there needs to be more support for victims, right? I mean, heaps of money invested to support victims and reward victims and compensate them, because honest, they're just traumatized for life. You know,
Yeah.
families are traumatized. One person dies, there's like 20 or 30 people who are viciously traumatized, as well as massive communities of hundreds of people for every one murder. Okay, I'll repeat the question for the people online. When it comes to self-defense, how can it be used to protect and make people in society safer, as well as making sure that the lines that it's encapsulating it are just and not carried away, right? I think that's where you're coming from. We know, I think a really good example is when you compare Chicago, a gun-free zone, where there's on average about, say, 30 homicides each weekend, and Texas, where they actually allow concealed carry. So in other words, you're allowed to carry a gun, you pack it in your pants, you know, because the people in Texas, they behave themselves. When they realize if they do something violent or stupid, someone can get a gun and shoot them. They behave themselves. But in a gun-free zone like Chicago, the assumption is everyone's vulnerable, everyone's unarmed. I have a gun, I'm invincible, and we have murder galore happening. So I think that speaks for itself, but I don't know if I can comment on it. Okay, so anyway, so where guns are forbidden, then guns are rampant, and where guns are allowed, and even allowed to be carried secretively, then we find that crime goes low. In fact, in Florida, there was one point in time where Florida was actually being advertised globally as a dangerous place to go, because gangs of kids were going and they were just killing tourists. And they sat them down saying, why are you guys killing tourists? And they said, well, because we know that tourists aren't allowed to have guns. So if we see a rental car in Florida, we figure they're tourists from out of the country, and we just jump them because we know that they're safe targets. And so unarming people made them more vulnerable. But I don't know, it must have been about 5 or 10 years ago, I went to America to present in a theological symposium over there. And one of the guys was giving a symposium on death penalty. So being a chosen topic of mine, I attended, and he spoke, and his conclusions were not related to anything biblical. He said simply, and he kept doing this, he kept saying holistically, you know, God's against the death penalty and we shouldn't do it anymore. I'm saying, well, you know, what was do you have any scriptures or do any principles? He goes, yeah, well, you know, the Bible says death penalty in the Old Testament, and the minister of God in the New Testament, and the avenger of blood, but holistically, God's against death. And I thought, where's he getting this from? You know, we can't make our own source of authority and just say the holistically, you know. You got to, what is the rest of your whole, you know? And so when I saw him at Macker's, I was all over him, you know, pressuring him there. And I saw him anywhere I saw this guy, I was on him like a fly, you know, and just saying, come on, give me some meat. Do you have any reason to justify this pacifist statement that you're making? You know, it's bleeding over into your justice, which God, you know, that's God's department. So we're still friends.